right, today's speaker is Mike Shannon. I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's a pretty good turnout. Dr. Mike Shannon is one of the professors at Cincinnati Christian University. Teaches the preaching classes for the students there. And it's a blessing to have him with us. Most of you had a handout from last week and got to see a little bit about him. Please take the time to get to know him afterwards. And without any further ado, we'll go ahead and let him come and present.
If I look vaguely familiar to some of you, I have preached for you occasionally when you've been between ministers, and I'm always glad to come back and get reacquainted. Not too long ago at our school, we had a visit by one of the most famous football players in the country, Tim Tebow. And it was an interesting time because it took a lot of logistical work to get him there, lots of people on campus, and he had two different speeches that he gave. And I remember in one of the speeches, he was talking about leadership, and he said, you know, all of us are leading someone. You may not be leading a large organization, but if leadership is influence, then all of us are leaders because we're all influencing someone. So I'm going to be talking about a profile of a Christian leader tonight, but I want to point out that not everything in here is going to apply equally to everybody. I am going to be talking about leadership in the church, but I think no matter who you are, what age you are, there are aspects of this that will help you in your life. Every organization has leadership. The leadership may be poor or ineffective, but there is always someone or some group that takes responsibility and sets the course for the church. Now, it's sometimes difficult to describe what makes an effective leader because the qualities are often very subjective and sometimes very difficult to define. Leadership is one of those things we recognize when we see it, but we can never completely understand it. I'm going to be sharing with you 8 qualities of Christian leadership for us to consider tonight. We're going to move through these rather quickly, so don't worry that there are 8 of them. But these qualities would be adaptable to any organization, secular, religious, and any person. In view of that, let's lay the foundation by describing what must be present in the life of a truly spiritual or Christian leader. In the Christian world, a leader must possess both faithfulness and practicality. In fact, this is what distinguishes a Christian leader from leaders in other fields. Everyone agrees that a leader must be practical, but the Christian world demands that leadership must also be concerned with things like ethics, morality, righteousness. In the Christian world, leadership is exercised not to advance ourselves, but to advance the cause of someone else, namely Jesus Christ. If there is a crisis in the church today, it may be a doctrinal crisis, but after that, it is a leadership crisis. Those willing to accept leadership are sometimes those who shouldn't. And those who should accept leadership are often the unwilling. Often no one is sure who is supposed to lead. And while these questions are important, they are not really pertinent to my main focus tonight. I want to talk about the qualities of leadership. Now, we're going to consider the qualities today that should be present in any Christian leader. Whether it's a preacher, an elder, a deacon, a Sunday school teacher, a youth leader, all need to have these following attributes. I want to begin by suggesting that leadership is dreaming. Leaders know what needs to be done and usually have a very clear picture of what their ultimate goal is. Leaders are often frustrated when others in the group do not share their vision. But if others immediately share the leader's vision, then the leader would no longer be a leader. If he were not several steps ahead of the rest of the group, then he's just a part of the crowd. A leader always has an idea before everyone else does, and that's, again, what makes him a leader. Now, I don't want to suggest when I say that leadership is dreaming, is to suggest that's all there is. In fact, there are several things in the list after this that make dreaming only one aspect of leadership. There are some people I've talked to today who think that's all there is to leadership, just creating some big, grandiose vision. Sometimes when I talk to the students at the school, they'll talk about, well, I want to shoot for the stars, and maybe if I shoot for the stars, I'll hit the moon. Now, I think I know what they mean when they say that, but how would that have worked in the space program? I think in the space program, they shot for the moon and hit the moon. And so I'm much more about figuring out what it is that is doable, challenging, yes, but doable, and finding a real way to get there. Now, that is an element of dreaming to that. The largest church in the world It was in Seoul, Korea. The minister there was named Paul Cho. He often spoke about the necessity of dreams. He even created a special theology. He called it the fourth dimension. He described how he meditated on his desired goal and how his desired goal incubated in his thinking and eventually became a reality. Now, I do want to tell you that some of Cho's theology is very inaccurate. Sometimes his interpretations are very far-fetched, but there is one aspect of what he said that is well taken. We live by faith and not by sight. We don't set dreams so high that everybody immediately says, I'm discouraged, we'll never do that. But we need to have ideas and dreams big enough that people get excited about it. And so, first of all, leadership is dreaming. But also, leadership is communicating. Just knowing where to go is not enough. Leading is communicating. Since a leader needs to help others, he must communicate accurately what the vision can accomplish in the church. He wants to capture the imagination of the group. In church work, often the preacher is the ideal person to be the communicating leader. After all, he has the opportunity to share, perhaps several times a week, a message from the Word of God. In these messages, perhaps he can communicate to the people proper biblical practices and models for the church. If there are some items more crucial than others, then the communication would be on one of the most crucial lists. It has been conventional wisdom that one of the reasons Ronald Reagan was so effective was because he was a great communicator. Totally aside from politics, you look at the people we elect for president. Most of the time, it is the person who communicates better. Not always, but most of the time. This communication is, of course, not done just from the pulpit on Sundays or Wednesdays. It's a communication that's often carried out one-on-one with people in the church. There must be a regular dissemination of information if a congregation is to feel a part of the task. Communication, of course, is not just talking, but it's also listening. Now, what is real listening? Do we listen just to make people think we're paying attention? In other words, we know they're talking, but we don't really listen to the information. Or do we pick up the information only to argue the point with them? Or do we really listen to someone's point of view and make that part of our decision making? So the effective leader must be able to pick up cues. Maybe cues from church members who are unhappy. Maybe he must listen past the actual words to the things being said that aren't obvious in the church, to understand hidden agendas and secret desires. I remember one time there was a person who every time I asked him how he was feeling, he'd say, 110%. Now we all know there's no 110%, but that's what he would say. I'm 110% today. One day I said to him, how are you feeling today? He said, 90%. He dropped 20%, right? So I knew he wasn't feeling well. I need to tell you that 3 weeks later, he died. Most of us would be happy to be at 90%. But the cue was, here's a man who was always 110, and now he was only 90. Sometimes, when you hear someone's actual words, and you look at their tone of voice or their body language, which do you assume is correct? Usually you will assume that the tone of voice and body language is correct. If I were to say to you something like this, yep, it's a red letter day today for me, I'll tell you, I had a great day today. Oh, it was one for the books. Now, if you were just to take a transcript of that, it would look like I had a great day. But you would know from the little nuances that I'm saying exactly the opposite. So we need to be able to pick up on that. So communicating is not just speaking, but it's also listening. So we start by having a dream, and then we try to communicate that dream, and we listen to feedback as we share that dream. And that means that the next step for a leader is delegating. You've heard this a lot. We need to delegate tasks sometimes to other people who are better at it than we are. Of course, I'm always worried about the poor person who has nobody to delegate to. This person delegates to this person, that person ends up doing all the work, right? Well, we don't mean by delegating that person does all the work, but there are times when someone else can carry it out better than we can. No one person can do the work alone. And the group cannot do it without supervision. Delegating is perhaps the most difficult task for a highly motivated person to do. Because he's tempted to say, well, when you want it done right, do it yourself. He is frustrated at the amount of energy and supervision that's necessary when you're delegating to somebody. because you have to explain how you want it done. You have to be very, very specific. In the early stages, delegating seems more time-consuming than doing it yourself. However, there are great benefits in later stages when people develop confidence in their abilities and just to do it themselves. Jack Canfield is one of the writers of the fabulously successful Chicken Soup for the Soul series. He says, I believe in one meeting delegation. He says, here's what I mean. He said, I bring in somebody who's going to work for me. I lay it all out exactly. This is what I expect. If you don't produce that, I'll have one meeting with you to correct it. And if it's not corrected, then we will no longer work together. But he said, to make that work, I have to tell them very specifically what I expect. And then I always give them one chance to mess up and correct it. But after that, then we part company. Peter Wagner was one of the great students of how churches work. And he said that delegation is the key to a church growing and particularly getting past the 200 mark. He says that a church grows as a congregation assumes the task of ministry. He's basically verifying that he can delegate, isn't he? Delegation has an additional benefit in that the minister's health, particularly, is spared many unnecessary burdens if we're all sharing ministering to each other. Don't worry, there'll always be plenty of work for your minister to do, even with all the delegating. It's a difficult transition, and some ministers never make it. They like being the chaplain, they like being the doer. But little by little, it is our job to help train you also for works of ministry. So if leadership is dreaming and communicating and delegating, oh, now we see it's also motivating. If delegating is going to work, then we must motivate those who are delegating. We must see that this is an essential part of leadership. The concept of delegation works so well in theory, but many find it difficult to put into practice. Most people do not come to church to work. Let's face that. Most come to receive. Few come to church to get involved, but few will remain if they don't get involved. Here's where the minister needs to be a motivator, or any leader needs to be a motivator. We need to be able to recruit. We need to be able to train. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We need to know how to put the right person in the right position for them. I always like to put people in positions they're already passionate about. That's another thing that Tim Tebow said to the students. One of the students said, what is your secret for success? Tebow said, either do what you're passionate about or get passionate about what you're doing. Because if you're passionate about what you're doing, you have separated yourself from 90% of the people on the planet. Because most people aren't passionate about what they're doing. Well, whatever job description we have, ministers, leaders, elders, deacons, whatever, I think recruiting and motivating ought to be high on the list of responsibilities. It is a fact of life. It seems at times we are constantly filling positions. Motivating helps us get a person to do a job as well or better than we would do it, and it helps keep that person doing that job. We know then also that leadership involves training. I mentioned that a moment ago. This process is not complete without this fifth quality. We need to see that leadership is in fact training. Too often in the church, we throw people into a job like the proverbial father throwing the child in the deep end of the pool. Then we wonder why they splash around and scream, right? We should never send a person into a job without proper training. It will only frustrate them and us and whoever they're leading. Many Sunday school teachers have been handed a quarterly and said, go back and teach junior high kids, and never to be thanked or never to be seen again. We need to do more than that. We need to help people develop their skills. Now, training may involve having classes, having events like this, but it also can involve on-the-job training. Let someone teach as an assistant before they become a teacher themselves. Let them call as a partner to somebody else visiting or calling. Most people I know in the church are concerned that they will do an inadequate job. If we train them properly, clearly showing them the expectations and the skills necessary, we'll have a much better chance of retaining them. They say in the business world that if you're doing a lot of firing, it means you didn't do a good job hiring. Excuse me, meaning that you didn't give that person clear expectations and clear training. It's often a failure of our organization when they have to fire. So the second quality is important to the one we just talked about. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I also believe that leadership is encouraging people. Now this should happen at every level, at every possible time. There is a new adage out there in the business world, perhaps you've heard it, catch people doing something right. We always want to catch people doing something wrong. Assure them that their job is being done adequately. Assure them that their job is meaningful and helpful to the cause. I remember one time it occurred to me that sometimes we use language in a certain way that sounds demeaning. We don't mean it that way. But we think about a job chart and you hear somebody say, from the top person all the way down to the maintenance person. How does that sound when we say something like that? I sensed in a church that I was serving that one of our maintenance people felt that way. And I finally said to him, I want you to feel good about what you do. Do you realize before anybody ever hears me preach, before anybody ever hears us sing or hears a singing group, they see the condition of the church building. And they will make a judgment before they ever get in here on the basis of how it looks. I said, you are actually the first impression for the church. So don't in any way demean what you do. Now, every team likes to have cheerleaders. Even a coach in his coaching experience will sometimes have to be a cheerleader. Why don't we raise up cheerleaders in the church and not be afraid occasionally to cheer ourselves on? There are all kinds of spiritual gifts in the church. Maybe we should add one in the 21st century, say cheerleading. Can we forget that among the things we are asked to do for one another according to the Scriptures is to what? Edify one another, which means to build up. To build up. It is so easy to tear down, so hard to build up. Some years ago, I was preaching a sermon on edification, and I had a table out. And I had some blocks on the table, and I brought one of the elders up, and I gave him a stopwatch. And I said, I want you to see how long it takes me to build a house with my blocks. And so he hit the stopwatch, and I built this little house with the blocks, and he said, it took you 35 seconds. I said, all right, now I want you to see how long it takes me to destroy my little house. So I said, you say on the mark, set, go. He said, on the mark, set, go. I took my hand, slipped it across that house, 2 seconds, and the house is gone. My point was, it is much more skillful to create, to build up, than it is to tear down. It's so easy to tear down because we are human beings. We do have flaws and faults. We make mistakes. But the Bible says, edify, build up one another. It is easy if you look to find a need for encouragement at every level of church life. One time I mentioned this in class and the student said, but when you do that, aren't you training people to do the Lord's work for the wrong thing? I said, what wrong thing would that be? They said, aren't you training people to do things for praise? And I said, well, doesn't the Bible say that we want to hear the Lord say, well done, good and faithful servant? He's not here right now, I am. So I'm going to tell him now, well done, good and faithful servant, in preparation for hearing it later. I also said to the student, I said, do you like when somebody says they like your sermon? He said, well, of course. I said, guess what? You're getting paid every Sunday. There's a lot of people in the church aren't getting paid a dime. So they don't get paid, plus nobody tells them good job. So how can this be a horrible thing? Look at all those lists at the end of Paul's writings of people he thanked as his partners in the ministry. Nothing wrong with encouraging people. Have any of you ever seen that TV show, Undercover Boss? That's one of my favorite shows. I think it should be required reading of everybody who leaves. There have been so many wonderful episodes, but the one that really caught my attention was a couple of years back. It was the business that runs a lot of parks like Dollywood. In fact, they run the aquarium down here. Hirschhorn Family Entertainment, I believe is the name of it. And their CEO went out and worked behind the scenes. And one of the things he said when he was interviewed after that experience, he says, I've decided that a CEO should not be chief executive officer, it should be chief encouragement officer. He learned that how much it meant to people to be told by the boss, you're doing a good job, you're doing well. We were watching, my wife and I, Undercover Boss. You know that big reveal at the end when he shows who he is, the boss, and people are getting worried, And before he gives them any of the big prizes, he just says, it was a privilege to work with you. You're exactly what this company needs. I saw you work so hard. Have you seen people just break down in tears? Even before they got the big, $5,000 gift, they were crying because somebody said, thank you, you did a good job. Well, that really impressed my wife. And even though my wife's not really a boss, she works for the Kroger Company at the corporate office, and she thought about the lady who cleans up the bathrooms, and she said, you know, that lady keeps our bathrooms immaculate. I've never come in it when it wasn't working, when it wasn't well stocked, and it wasn't immaculate. Next time I see her, I'm going to tell her how much I appreciate it. So she said, I'm going to do that today. So I asked her after, how did it go? She said, you won't believe this. She was coming out of the restroom, and I said to her, you know, I've been coming in this restroom for almost 10 years now, and it has always been immaculate. You always take good care of us. I just want you to know I appreciate it. I said, what happened? So the woman broke down and cried. She said, nobody has ever told me that. Now, my wife's not the boss, but she learned something from Undercover Boss, how much people want and need encouragement. There are many events, some trivial and some important, that can cause a person to doubt their abilities or their competence. It's important for them to know that they are not failures. There's a great benefit when the leader shares with them his confidence, or sometimes bestows forgiveness. Sometimes this encouragement can be viewed on a totally different level. There's a sense in which a group has momentum. It is the leader's job to make sure that momentum is positive. If the leader's responsibility is to keep morale high, then you're going to get momentum. This, of course, you can do in many public events as well as private events. And I believe private praising is probably just as valuable as praising in public. We've got 3 more to go. We're almost there. Leadership is also evaluating. Another constant need is reflected in that statement. Leadership is evaluating. We need to have a practical mindset to be able to look at our church programs and separate them from our self-worth. We need to be able to evaluate our programs. Is it effective? Is it worth the cost? Is it worth the time? These are questions that are vitally important. The cause of Christ is too important to see it rendered ineffective by a misuse of our greatest resources. Someone once said evaluating is like planning in reverse. Planning is future-oriented, evaluating is past-oriented. And we want to be able to objectively recognize what went right, what went wrong. While, of course, we are focusing on past events, there is still a sense in which we are looking to the future. In our evaluation, we want that to help make us more effective the next time. This evaluation is not just a review of statistics, by the way, although they're important. Statistical analysis can help us in the church, but evaluation must go beyond the charts and the graphs. We must add our own intuition into the process. I was reading the other day that, the Reds' greatest hitter is Joey Votto. And Joey Votto has set a model for his life, and that is Ted Williams. He carries Ted Williams' book with him all the time to motivate him. And when he feels like he's in a slump, he goes out and he looks at Ted Williams' advice, he looks at the tape, and tries to figure out what he's doing wrong. Sometimes it's a little subtle way, just where the shoulder is, the head is. So evaluating is not something that should make us nervous or make us think terribly of ourselves. It's a tool to even get better. Just as Joey Votto has a mentor, I suppose all of us ought to have a mentor model, and that's what leadership is too. It's not just yelling from the sidelines. Leadership is modeling in our own lives what we think other people should be doing. We sometimes talk about the equipping ministry, and it's sometimes gotten a bad name because some people erroneously use that concept to justify not actually doing anything. That I will equip others and I won't do it. Well, if the leader's not willing to do it, very little chance that he'll motivate anybody else to do it too. They will not catch the vision until they have seen it in a person, a preacher, an elder, a deacon, a teacher. They want to know that their leader is willing to back up their vision by hard work and sweat. There are some things better caught than taught. That's what the old adage says. Isn't this in essence what discipling is all about? Jesus in his daily walk modeled his way of life for the disciples to note and emulate. When my daughter was younger, it's hard for me to believe now, my daughter's now 25. She's an operating room nurse. They actually let her cut people up and everything. It's an amazing thing for me because I remember her as this little kid. I remember when she was on a soccer team, she had a soccer coach with an interesting kind of coaching. As far as I can tell, the soccer coach never actually coached her to do anything. The soccer coach would simply have a bullhorn and holler at the kids. No, you're not run. No. And in practice, there was never any, this is the way we dribble the ball, this is the way we shoot. It was just yelling during the game. Well, that obviously wasn't working. They needed to go out there and she needed to show them specifically how to do these things. One more thing for us. Leadership is also deciding, being willing to make a decision and live with it. In the midst of all the activities and programs of the church, this is a very difficult quality. Because to decide limits us. To decide puts us at risk. Sometimes we think we can avoid risks by not choosing. Of course, this is fruitless and unproductive. Sometimes it's not a matter of choosing the only right program, but choosing the best program. And sometimes it's not necessarily choosing what's best, but what's good and what the congregation will get behind. Sometimes we choose something rather than nothing. This quality is difficult because life is, in essence, the sum total of our choices. We need to remember that very few of our choices will be absolutely crucial and life-changing, but the accumulation of our choices will be. Is it not one big decision? It is not rather one big decision which determines success, but a lot of small, sound decisions. Very few times will one decision make you or break you. It will sometimes, but rarely. A mediocre program, carried out with enthusiasm and hard labor, is better than the greatest program that lies dormant. It is difficult to accept responsibility of making those decisions, which determines the course and health of the church. But that is the price of leadership. In a way, we've come full circle back to number one. It's one thing to dream a big dream, but are we willing to decide to do those things which make the dream come true? So these qualities I've talked about this evening, when brought into the leadership picture, will promote more effectiveness in the Christian life and Christian work. There is a price, of course, to pay for leading. One of those prices is criticism. Criticism. So one thing I wasn't prepared for when I went into ministry is how much second-guessing and criticism a leader in the church gets. Well, leadership is sometimes a difficult job, but somebody's got to do it. It is essential. Every service organization needs leadership. An army needs leadership. An educational institution needs leadership. An athletic team needs leadership. A business needs leadership. And yes, the church needs leadership. In whatever way is appropriate to you, remember that you will be a leader in some fashion. Remember also the promise of Jesus. Lo, I am with you always. Yes, leadership is a challenging task, but we are not in it alone. With that, I'm willing to talk to you for a while. We'll take a few minutes to see if you want to ask anything. I've covered a wide variety of subjects, but I'd be happy if you would like to interact. While you're thinking about that, one of the things I want to throw in is that I get interested today that a lot of people think there's only one style of leadership. What we've discovered is there's at least four, maybe more. Just because you may not be real outgoing doesn't mean you're not leading. So it doesn't have to be just one kind of personality. Now there are certain kinds of leaders who think their style is the only kind, but those who study such things realize that every personality can, in some way, lead. All right, now I'm looking for any of you. How do you deal with criticism? Well, I'll tell you, it took me a while. I used to stay up nights worrying about it. I used to let it gnaw at my stomach. And then I decided, first of all right, whatever they're criticizing me for, they're either right or they're wrong. If they're wrong, then I can ignore the criticism. If they're right, I can use the criticism to make some kind of change if I think it's necessary. So I just decided to call it something else. I just call it feedback. And I still, none of us really like it. I'm not even going to say today that I really like it. I don't. But it doesn't keep me awake at night anymore. Another thing I discovered is sometimes the criticism, well, almost always, there's a grain of truth in it. It may be a very small grain. But I will ask myself, what's the grain of truth? If I can figure out what that is, and if I can do something about it, I will. If I can't, I just smile and keep going because there's not much. Back to talking about Tim Tebow again. They asked Tim Tebow in our session at the college, how do you deal with criticism? And he said, I've been criticized. Of course, everybody laughed. He said, if you accomplish anything in life, I'm pretty sure you'll hear two things. Somebody will say, at some point you can never do it. And if you do it, somebody will say you should have done it a different way. So he said, I've decided to work hard and give it my best and listen to the feedback and then put it to rest. So I don't know that we'll ever get to the place that we like it. But we can get to the place where it doesn't devastate us and can actually become our friend. You know, some of the great businesses live on feedback. They live for finding out what the customer likes and what the customer doesn't like. I remember though, when I tried this in my first church, I put up a suggestion box in my first church. Boy, did they make some interesting suggestions. One of them was, why don't you go back to Bible college again? It obviously didn't take the first time. That's pretty heavy criticism. That's the kind of thing that will keep you awake at night. Somebody else said, why don't you dress more like a preacher? I never was quite sure what that meant. I wore a jacket and tie every Sunday. This is back in the 70s. I don't know what it was I was doing that wasn't being like a preacher. Here's the one that was interesting. Somebody said, why don't you preach your own sermons rather than preaching what other people have written? Now, there was something that I knew that they didn't know. I was preaching what I was writing. And I thought, my critic thinks my preaching is so good that somebody else wrote it. So I decided rather than it be a criticism, I would wear it as a badge of honor. Wow, my critic thinks my stuff's good enough to be in print. Excuse me, so sometimes you can turn it around. Any other questions?
Criticism can be a kind of evaluation.
Right. I mean, all evaluations involve some kind of criticism. You know, even constructive criticism is going to be a little bit disappointing to us. But you know what? Unless you believe you're perfect, and I've rarely seen anybody who thought he was perfect, and we can certainly find things ourselves that we would like to do better. Now, of course, if we're ever in a position where we have to criticize someone, we obviously want to do that with as much kindness and as much of a positive spirit as we can, because we know how dangerous it can be. I always believe that if you're going to criticize somebody, also find something good to say too, so that you can give them a positive vision for what they're doing. In fact, what I taught earlier in my career, the praise sandwich, or the criticism sandwich. Start with praise, then give the criticism, and then give the praise again. And the person might be more willing to hear it. Yeah. One time, I had to do an evaluation for an employee, and I laid out as gently as I could some things I thought needed to be changed. And the employee said, but you do this, and you do that, and you do this. And I finally said, you know, everything you just said is true. I do those things. And the elders are going to be evaluating me. But right now, I'm evaluating you. So this meeting's about you. It's not about me. I'll get my comeuppance eventually. Don't worry about that. What is my favorite flavor of Kool-Aid? Are you really interested in that? Great. Great. That's it? You know, maybe he's thinking Kool-Aid because sometimes you have that for your snacks. Is that or your food? Is that what you do? If you're ready to move on to that, it's okay. I'm looking back at the preacher. Oh, we have another.
Outside of Jesus, in your opinion, who's the best biblical leader?
Outside of Jesus, what?
In your opinion, who's the best biblical leader?
I like Barnabas in the book of Acts. Quiet leader, but you think about the fact that whenever there was an emergency, they sent Barnabas. We don't know what's going on up there in Antioch. They're doing all kinds of crazy things up there. Let's have Barnabas go check it out. Barnabas goes up and tells them it's okay. They say, all right. Barnabas says it's okay, it's okay. Barnabas sees this need, immediately thinks, I'm gonna get Paul up here. He gets Paul up there, they preach together. Then they decide, we're going to start churches just like Antioch. Let's go. He takes Paul with him. He also takes John Mark. He was always developing leaders. And John Mark gets mad, remember, upset or whatever, has to go home. Paul doesn't like it, so next time Paul says, I won't travel with him again. Barnabas says, well, I will. And you go your separate way. You never hear of Barnabas again. But later, Paul says, John Mark is a great comfort to me. It says to me Barnabas was right all along. Paul was wrong about that one. And that's someone I've been very fond of through the years, Barnabas.
Are there particular tools or resources that you recommend for training, teaching leaders? You found helpful?
Well, one that just popped into my mind, excuse me, there goes under different names. It's sometimes called the Performax system, sometimes it's called DISC, D-I-S-C, and it identifies 4 different kinds of leaders. The short version is D stands for dominant, right? And then S stands for steadiness, C stands for conscientiousness, and I don't remember what I stands for, but I remember what it was. It's the person who's having a good time. Hey, life's great, we're having a party. And remember I said earlier, there's some leaders who think they're the only kind? High D people think that's real leadership. They don't think the rest of them can lead. But the Performax people say, no, all of these people can lead. So the way it's been described is, if there's a wall, the high D person crashes through it and then tries to figure out how he did it. If there's a wall, the high I person gets a group together and says, all right, gang, how can we do this? Yay, let's go, everybody over the wall. The high S person is on the top of the wall saying, everybody, come on, I'll help you get over. The high C person he's measuring the wall, he's figuring the wall out, and it may take him a little longer, but they're going to get over it the first time because he figured it out. All of us have some of those qualities. So, when I was in church work, we would give everybody on the staff that DISC profile. I was a high S person, and all of my staff were high D persons. That means that was a real struggle for me to keep the high Ds from bumping into each other. Because they were all hard-charging people, they were charging into each other all the time. So that's helpful. And some people have adapted this to biblical principles and have actually found Bible characters that B, I, S, and C stand for. And so church people can often be trained in that with a biblical perspective. Such as the first thing that popped in my life. I found it very useful because it taught me how to lead my staff. How does a high S person lead high D people? And there's certain techniques that are helpful.
When should the youth lead when they're at school? And what are ways that they can lead?
When should they meet?
When should they lead? And what are ways that they can?
You said lead, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, probably unless young people have been given a position in a club or an organization, their leadership is going to be informal. But if you're on student council, if you're the captain of a ball team, then people are going to be looking up to you. But there are other ways that you lead just by, we talked earlier about example. And in any school or organization, how many times have you heard them talk about the Reds and the team leaders? They say, who lead by example. And so I think that by itself, if you start leading by example, pretty soon they're going to start electing you to leadership positions. But you're not going to lead if you're just like everybody else. You got to do some things other people aren't willing to do if you want to lead. Okay. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.